Number 10. The Yellow Submarine of Barbados. Barbados is famous for offering some of the world's best diving locations. Visitors could explore at least 17 wrecks in the crystal blue Caribbean Sea. Off the island's west coast, there's a yellow submarine that tends to take divers by surprise. It's located near the Pamir, a German-built cargo ship that sank during a hurricane in 1957. The Yellow Submarine reportedly belonged to a property tycoon who owned land in Barbados. According to the story, he always wanted a submarine of his own, so he went ahead and bought it without thinking about the price of maintaining it. When the costs of owning the vessel got out of control, the man decided that it wasn't such a fun idea after all. Eager to just get rid of it, he simply dumped it near the shore and forgot about it. Another legend claims that the man had ordered a customized submarine to show off to his friends when they visited him in Barbados, but it wasn't finished on time, so he had a replica made just to give them an idea of what the final product would look like. After his guests saw the replica, the eccentric businessman allegedly had it sunk to the seafloor near his yacht. It's hard to know which of these stories, if any, are true, because there's not much information available about the submarine or its owner, including his name or when he tossed it into the sea. Number 9. Mystery Gulf Coast Shipwreck. While conducting a seafloor survey in the Gulf of Mexico in 2011, workers from the Shell Oil Company noticed a blip on their sonar roughly 200 miles offshore. They alerted the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which sent its own researchers to investigate the strange object using a remotely operated vehicle. It was the rotting hull of a copper-plated wooden ship that likely sailed sometime during the early to mid-19th century. The wreck sits 4,000 feet below the waves. It is filled with muskets, cannons, glass bottles, eyeglasses, ceramic plates, a stove, and more. The stove is an especially rare artifact. It's one of just a handful of surviving examples ever found, according to maritime archaeologist Jack Arion from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. National Geographic reported that the ship could have been a pirate vessel, a passenger ship, or used for some other purpose. But for now, nobody knows of its identity or origins. Number 8. Gold of a Lost Empire. Between the 7th and 11th centuries, the powerful Srivijaya Empire controlled much of Asia's maritime trade. The civilization was headquartered on what is now the Indonesian island of Sumatra in the city of Palembang. It left behind little archaeological evidence, leaving modern experts with limited knowledge of what the Srivijaya Empire was like. No traces of the city's buildings have been found, perhaps because they were buried by a volcano or because they were made from wood and deteriorated. Much of what researchers know about Srivijaya comes from the eyewitness accounts of travelers who passed through. It was reportedly rich in gold and used its wealth to build advantageous relationships with China and other powerful societies. The empire also financed Buddhist monasteries and temples in China, Java, and India. No official archaeological excavations have been carried out in the area, but people began finding coins, jewelry, and other treasure along the Musi River in 2011, and the discoveries continue to this day. Late last year, divers found gold rings, beads, precious gems, a Buddha statue, and other objects that are thought to be from the Srivijaya Empire. British maritime archaeologist Sean Kingsley suspects that Srivijaya was a floating city made out of wood, which rotted after the city's abandonment and caused artifacts to sink to the bottom of the river. Indonesia imposed a moratorium on underwater archaeology back in 2010, but this isn't enough to stop people from conducting their own dives in search of valuable items, and those who find artifacts by chance are unlikely to report their discoveries. Unfortunately, this leaves experts empty-handed and unable to learn more about the mysterious civilization and its unexplained collapse. Number 7. An Invisible Island. Google Earth and Google Maps have changed the way discoveries are made because they make the world so much accessible to ordinary people. Many internet users browse these programs in their spare time and have even made a hobby out of searching for strange and undiscovered structures. It's led to some fascinating finds, but it's also a popular way for overly imaginative conspiracy theorists to get carried away. Last year, the Chelanamkarshika Tourism Development Society noticed what looked like a bean-shaped island in the Arabian Sea near the southwest Indian city of Kochi. The organization posted a screenshot of the peculiar piece of land on Facebook, attracting the attention of social media users who are familiar with the area. There's no visible land at the site. According to Google Maps, the island could measure nearly 5 miles long and 2.2 miles wide, but it's undetectable to the naked eye. Officials from the Kerala University of Fisheries and Ocean Studies said that they plan to further investigate the strange sliver of land. It looks similar to numerous underwater islands that experts are familiar with, but without looking into the matter, they don't know what the formation is made of or how it was formed. What's the craziest thing you've seen on Google Earth? Let us know in the comments below and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Number 6. Ancient Offerings. Located along the modern-day border between Bolivia and Peru, Lake Titicaca was one of the ancient Incas' most sacred sites. The once powerful civilization considered the lake to be their place of origin, and its significance increased dramatically during the 16th and 17th centuries. Many artifacts that have been found at the site speak to its importance. During an underwater survey a few years ago, archaeologists discovered a small box measuring just 14 by 10 by 6.5 inches. The container is made from a locally sourced volcanic stone called andesite. The artifact was retrieved from 18 feet below the water's surface, where it had sat undisturbed for more than 5 centuries. It contained a llama figurine made from a rare and valuable coral shell, as well as a small rolled sheet of gold. Researchers believe that the items were immersed into the lake as part of a ritualistic offering to the Inca gods. The box is just one of the numerous discoveries at Lake Titicaca that were likely deposited as part of a spiritual ceremony. Over 24 stone boxes have been recovered from another part of the lake, but the contents of only 4 were found intact. They contained offerings including figurines of male and female humans, as well as llamas made from precious metals and other valuable materials. Christopher Delisle, who co-authored a study on the artifacts, told National Geographic that the offerings contained requests of varying amounts and contexts, including political and agricultural pleadings. He also said that the Inca, who lived along Lake Titicaca, were likely influenced by previous cultures such as the Tiwanaku, who inhabited the area between 200 BC and 1000 AD. But the exact meanings and dynamics behind the offerings are admittedly up for debate among experts who are still trying to interpret them. Number 5. Unidentified Jellyfish. During a deep water dive off the coast of Newport, Rhode Island last year, scientists from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration spotted a blood-red jellyfish that they didn't recognize. Using a remotely operated vehicle, the team captured footage of the bizarre blob-like specimen nearly 2,300 feet beneath the water's surface. Researchers think that the creature belongs to the genus Paralia. The only other Paralia species that's known to exist is also found in deep waters throughout the world's oceans. Numerous other aquatic animals were observed during the dive, which was conducted as part of the NOAA's North Atlantic Stepping Stones expedition. The mission's goal was to document elusive deep-sea creatures that lurk at depths that we haven't yet thoroughly explored. Just days earlier, the team observed a yellow sea sponge and a pink sea star lounging side by side, roughly 6,184 feet underwater. After seeing a photo on Twitter, marine biologist Christopher Ma likened the pair to a real-life SpongeBob and Patrick. Number 4. The Holy Grail of Shipwrecks. While exploring the waters off Bulgaria in 2018, scientists from the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project spotted a shockingly intact shipwreck. By then, the team had already seen at least 60 other sunken vessels, but this one stood out among the others because of how incredibly well preserved it was. It sits over a mile below the surface in what's known as the anoxic layer of the sea, where there's less oxygen in the water. Physical and chemical decay happen much more slowly at extreme depths, which is why the ship is in such great condition despite being an estimated 2,400 years old. It's not the oldest submerged vessel in the region, but it's the only known ship of its age that contains a preserved mast, rowing benches, and other features that are not normally seen in wrecks from that time period. The ancient boat resembles the vessel seen in Greek artwork, offering a hint about its possible origins. A portion of the wreck was raised and radiocarbon dated to the 5th century BC, when Greek city-states and Mediterranean colonies frequently traded along the Black Sea coast. While little is known about the ship itself, its pristine state is giving experts an unprecedented glimpse back in time. Number 3. H.L. Hunley. Also known as the CSS Hunley, the H.L. Hunley was the first combat submarine to sink a warship. Built in Mobile, Alabama during the Civil War, it first carried Confederate Navy soldiers into battle in 1863. The vessel entered Charleston Harbor on a mission to destroy a Union blockade on the city, but something caused it to sink, killing 5 of the men aboard. The sub was launched again a few months later, but the entire 8-man crew died because someone left a valve open, causing the Hunley to sink. Once again, the Confederate Navy recovered the vessel and put it back into service. It was launched for a 3rd time in early 1864, but vanished along with its crew after sinking the U.S. Navy ship USS Housatonic with a torpedo. The submarine remained missing until 1995, when a team of shipwreck hunters found it in Charleston Harbor right next to the Housatonic. 5 years later, the Hunley was raised. Nobody knows what caused the vessel to sink. According to the non-profit Friends of the Hunley, the crew may have ran out of oxygen and suffocated to death due to the tides. Another ship may have clipped the sub, it may have been destroyed by its own torpedo, or an enemy shooter may have somehow disabled the captain, causing the submarine to fill with water and drown the crew. But these are all guesses, and we'll probably never know exactly what doomed the Hunley. Number 2. Submarine frozen in time. In late 2020, a salvage team from the New Jersey-based Atlantic Wreck Salvage Company claimed to have found a World War I-era submarine off the Maryland coast. They discovered the wreck in an upright position on the ocean floor between Cape May and Ocean City. Using advanced sonar technology, the team captured a detailed image of the sub, which enabled them to take accurate measurements and examine it for any identifying features. The vehicle in question is believed to be a decommissioned R-8 US Navy submarine that was used in aerial bombardment tests in 1936. In other words, it was used for target practice. 4 100-pound bombs came close to the sub without hitting it and managed to sink it anyway. Speaking with the Press of Atlantic City, salvage team member Joe Marzani pointed out that there are no tragedies attached to the submarine, since it was empty when it sank. Because the discovery happened late in the year, divers weren't immediately dispatched to the scene, but the crew was fairly certain that they had found an R-8, and to their credit, all signs point toward them being right. The team discovered the wreck as part of an ongoing quest to recover sunken torpedoes and submarines in the region. Number 1. Port of Emys. Built during the 3rd or 4th century BC, the port of Emys was an artificial harbor near what is now the city of Limassol in southern Cyprus. Experts describe it as an impressive but short-lived large public port project of the Hellenistic period which may never have been completed. The site consists of 3 piers made from large carved rectangular stones, which were built to protect ships from strong winds. Today, it sits 13 feet underwater and extends 328 feet from the shore. Sadly, it looks as though the ancient harbor was never actually used. By the 6th century AD, all of the city's residents had fled Emys. Archaeologists think that the exodus may have been triggered by Arab raids, but they admittedly aren't sure. Experts first investigated the site during the 1980s. In 2005, an artificial reef was established among the ruins, and it has greatly damaged the structures. Officials want to turn the site into an underwater park, and it's fueling tensions among environmentalists who are concerned about the proposed removal of a protected marine plant called Neptune grass, and those who want to see the harbor preserved. Authorities have made it clear that they're pushing forward with the plans. They promise the public that they will protect both the Neptune grass, which is vital to aquatic ecosystems in the Mediterranean, and the submerged ruins.
Number 10. Bristol Bow Fighter. On March 17, 1943, a Bristol Bow Fighter with the Royal Air Force suffered engine problems and went crashing down into the sea. The pilot and the observer were lucky enough to survive, but unfortunately, the two-seater heavy fighter was lost. The wartime aircraft built by the Bristol Aeroplane Company sank to the bottom of the ocean. It's actually still sitting on the sandy seabed today at a depth of around 120 feet, just shy of 3,000 feet from the city of St. Julian's Point in Malta. Most of the plane has been buried in sand by now, but some parts are still visible to divers brave enough to visit the site. The wings and the main fuselage are still intact, the tires are sticking out from behind the radial engines, and the side propeller still looks as though it could spin. And to make this place even more interesting, there are plenty of other wrecks here. The floor of the ocean off the coast of Malta is a whole graveyard of warplanes, from the Bristol Blenheim bomber to the Lockheed P-2V Neptune. It's a haunting reminder of the tragedies of war and the heavy military vessels soldiers once controlled. Number 9. Churchill's Abandoned War Room. Underneath the streets of Westminster in England, the abandoned war room used by Churchill still sits 10 feet below solid ground. It's located in the basement of the Treasury Building, originally established in 1938. It was a secret underground meeting space for the main players in the British war effort. One of these people was Winston Churchill, who spent the majority of his time in and out of the secret war room plotting and scheming. The facility once included dormitories for the staff, private bedrooms for the senior ministers, and a main bedroom for Churchill himself. He used his room to work, to host meetings, and to take his much-needed daily naps. He even had a microphone on his desk linked directly to the broadcasting room at the BBC. From his underground bunker, he made 4 very important speeches during the war. Much of his stuff is still down there today, although the entire base is abandoned and full of cobwebs. His famous chair in the meeting room is still there, still marked from where Churchill ground his nails on its arms during tense moments. Number 8. Hangar 4. About 100 miles from Calgary in the Canadian province of Alberta, there's an abandoned airfield from the Second World War. There were originally 7 hangars built at Claresholm, but only one remains even remotely intact today. It's Hangar 4, and it's seen better days. Not much of its white paint remains. 80 years of harsh wind has sandblasted the hangar into an empty shell. The windows are shattered, and the only life forms here these days are the pigeons. The derelict building is surrounded by a metal fence of twisted barbed wire and old signs warning people not to enter. Back in 1943, there were over 100 air training fields across Canada. It was part of a major program to train air crews fighting in the war. This particular training base churned out pilots and airfield technicians. But when the war was over, Canada ceased being a major supplier of pilots, switching to a more peaceful and less militaristic stance on the world stage. Almost all the major air bases across the country were abandoned, including this one. Number 7. Kinross Auxiliary Airfield. The Kinross Auxiliary Airfield was built back in 1943 in Michigan. It was a small airfield with 3 runways and a small parking area. It was mostly used to refuel military aircraft on their way from elsewhere in America to Alaska. When the war was finally over, the airfield was used as a hub for private and commercial pilots. It became the official airport for the town of Sault Ste. Maria in 1945. But after 7 years of commercial service, the airfield was largely abandoned in 1952. There was one interesting thing that happened here. On November 23, 1953, the Air Force scrambled a jet from the airfield at Kinross to investigate a UFO flying in restricted airspace over Lake Superior. The jet pursued this object for 30 minutes at a whopping speed of 500 miles per hour. However, the object eventually disappeared and left no trace of itself behind. But the pilot who was chasing the UFO also vanished, First Lieutenant Felix Moncla. Neither Felix nor his plane, nor Second Lieutenant Robert Wilson, who had been working the radar, have ever been found. What do you think happened on that November day in 1953? How did a fighter jet with the American Air Force vanish without a trace, never to be found again? Remember, this didn't happen in some foreign country, it was in Michigan, and yet the plane has never been found. Let us know your thoughts on this bizarre case in the comments section down below, and don't forget to hit subscribe before the end of this video. Number 6. Abandoned Barracks. There's an eerie abandoned barracks from World War II hiding in England's Northamptonshire. It was first built almost a century ago in 1925, but today it just looks like the wreckage of some forsaken barn. It was originally called the Vostok camp, used as an immigration camp for Canadians when it was first established in the 1920s. It was sold to the War Office in 1939 and repurposed into an army camp. But when the war ended in 1945, it ended up being taken over by the US Army. The Army stuck around for a little while, but eventually left and the site went unoccupied. A company called Stewart's and Lloyd's Steelworks purchased the property at an auction. Over 100 people from Scotland moved in to work at the steel plant, but it fell apart in just a few years. Since the end of the 1960s, it's remained mostly empty. It was used briefly as a chicken farm, as a truck parking lot, and that's about it. Looking at it today, you'd never even know it was once home to thousands of soldiers preparing for war. Number 5. Veterans Shadow Box. A man named Gene Stefik was given a shadow box. The shadow box was discovered in an abandoned storage locker in Elkhart, Indiana. Gene didn't really know what to do with the box, which was filled with a World War II veteran's lost belongings, so he gave it to his brother. Luckily, his brother works with the Veterans Association, and so Gene was hoping he could track down the owner. Inside this mysterious box was a folded flag, campaign medals from both Germany and Africa, a Bible, a Bronze Star, and a Purple Heart, and some obituaries. Gene's brother was able to track down the veteran and his son, but both turned out to be deceased. He finally found his daughter still alive in West Virginia. He contacted the daughter, who couldn't believe her father's military awards had been found, and in an abandoned storage locker several states away of all places. Arrangements were made and Gene's brother drove all the way there to safely deliver the box personally to the veteran's next of kin. It took 7 hours, but it was well worth it to reunite the family with priceless military awards. Plus, the personal mementos of a fallen hero that could never have been replaced can now be passed on to future generations of the family. Number 4. Estonian Tank in the Mud. In Estonia, a young boy found an abandoned tank from World War II stuck in the mud. The vehicle had been stuck in the slime at the edge of what was once a lake since 1944, a Soviet T-34-76 tank. It was while the boy was exploring the woods near his home that he uncovered tank tracks leading into the shallow water. Curious, he started digging. That was when he found the armor of the tank's hull under a few feet of muck. He went back to his village and got help from the adults, who together managed to tow the thing out of the swamp and back onto dry land. The tank was in such amazing condition, it looked as though they could have turned the key and drove away in it. But of course it wasn't functional. It had been in the mud for 56 years at the time of its discovery in 2000. It was likely a casualty of fighting that occurred from February to September of 1944. In the northeastern part of Estonia, over 100,000 men were killed during combat between the Soviet Army and the German Army. The Germans must have captured this tank during the fighting. Then, when they retreated on September 19, 1944, the tank got left behind. The Germans probably pushed it into the lake to keep the Soviets from getting their hands on it. If you found tank tracks, would you follow them and dig to see what you'd find? Let us know how adventurous you are in the comments down below. Number 3. Abandoned Village. 80 years before today, the humble residents of a small English village called Ember were pushed out of their homes. It was the military who forced them out so they could use their village for combat training. The village was also very close to shell impact areas, and it would have become inhospitable anyway. The military took over the village, and when the war was over, they kept it. All these years later, the Ministry of Defense still owns the village, meaning the locals never got to see their houses again. It's been used periodically as a training site, but is mostly just left alone. The village is still in the exact same shape it was in the early days of the war. The only difference is that shells and explosions have ripped apart many of the main structures. The only thing modern is a military building constructed for training purposes in the 1960s. But these days, the military doesn't do any kind of training exercises. They refuse to give the village back, preferring it to sit abandoned. Number 2. Airbase for sale. Camp Picton opened in the year 1940 as a training school for pilots. Today, the abandoned training school in Prince Edward County, just 2 hours from Toronto, is 700 acres of prime land on the market for $15 million. Through the 1940s, it was used as an airbase. The Canadian Training School was involved in the Commonwealth Air Training Program. The school hosted pilots from New Zealand, the United States, Australia, and even the UK. 6 pilots actually died here during training and were buried at a nearby cemetery. Up to 800 troops took courses at the base at one time, with many of the soldiers from places like Australia miserable in the Canadian winters. Many of the initiates thought they had been brought to hell because it was so cold and snowy. By 1948, the base had become a gunnery school, but by 1960, there wasn't much need for it anymore. The base was closed, the local economy suffered, and the property was sold to the mayor of Picton. It's since been used as a movie set, to store props, and it was even featured in Canada's Worst Driver. But it remains abandoned to this day, and now it's up for sale for anyone who wants to live inside the ruined shell of an old air training school. Number 1. Abandoned Royal Air Force Base. In North Yorkshire, there's a Royal Air Force base that played a crucial role in defeating the Nazis back in World War II. It's completely abandoned now, having been left to rot for decades. But when it was built in 1937, it was a sight to behold. When war was announced 2 years later, fearless pilots used the base as their hub for operations while defending England's biggest cities against German bombing raids. Some of the first night fighters, pilots operating in near total blackness under the cover of night, set off from this very airbase. It was also home to the RAF Eagle Squadron, composed of American volunteers. It hosted the first Canadian RAF Squadron and the first Polish RAF Squadron. It was a multicultural nexus of air defense. But after the war was over, maintenance ceased. The station was used for a little while for pilot training, then completely left to the elements in the 1960s. Number 10. Flight 2303. China Northwest Airlines Flight 2303 took off from the city of Xi'an for Guangzhou at 8:13 a.m. on June 6, 1994. There were 160 people aboard, 146 passengers, and 14 crew members. Just 9 very short minutes after takeoff, the aircraft broke up in mid-flight and crashed on a farm in Mingdu Township, just 30 miles from the airport. There were no survivors. 24 seconds into the flight, the crew had reported that the plane was floating and making a strange sound. A few minutes later, the aircraft began to experience an unstable pitch-up. By the time it flew over Mingdu, the pilots were no longer able to fly at the plane's assigned altitude. They engaged the autopilot, but this only made things worse. The plane rolled violently to the right and then to the left as the stall warning activated. In just 12 seconds, it fell 15,476 feet at a speed of 464 miles per hour before disintegrating in the air and scattering the landscape with debris. Parts of the wreckage were found over an 18-mile area of farmland. An investigation blamed poor maintenance for the accident. Just hours before takeoff, the plane underwent maintenance at an unapproved facility where the autopilot was connected improperly. It was the deadliest plane crash to ever happen in mainland China. Number 9. Ancient viruses. As the COVID-19 pandemic enters its third year, it's probably safe to say that many people are more aware than ever before of just how dangerous viruses can be and how easily they can spread. They're also incredibly resilient, as a group of scientists learned in 2014 when they found 2 huge ancient viruses frozen 100 feet deep in the Siberian permafrost. Cue the X-Files theme song. Unlike modern viruses, these prehistoric pathogens, dubbed Pithovirus sibiricum and Mollivirus sibiricum, are large enough to view under a standard microscope. Researchers brought them back to life with alarming ease, and they quickly became infectious after being revived. Thankfully, these simple single-celled organisms don't pose much of a threat to humans, but they're not the only frozen viruses that could be released into the environment as climate change accelerates melting. In a more recent study, scientists identified 28 different viruses in a pair of 15,000-year-old ice cores from the Gulia ice cap in Tibet's Kulun Mountains. The samples were taken at around 22,000 feet above sea level. The team's findings add to a growing body of research about the ability of certain organisms to survive in extreme environments and how viruses respond to climate change. And the methods being used could help when it comes to learning about pathogens on other planets. Lead study author Zhiping Zhang developed a decontamination method to study the microbial lifeforms in the ice cores from the Gulia ice cap. The technique could potentially come in handy for identifying genetic sequences in other extreme icy environments, including Mars and the Moon. Number 8. Flu-infected bodies. More than 40 million people perished during the 1918 Spanish influenza outbreak, which left almost no corner of the globe untouched. That year, 6 young men died on the Norwegian island of Svalbard, which is located less than 800 miles from the North Pole in the high Arctic. Their bodies were unearthed in 1998 by a team of scientists who traveled to Svalbard in search of frozen corpses infected with the Spanish flu virus. The researchers identified fragments of the virus in the brains and organs of the young men, marking a first step in learning more about the little-understood disease. From start to finish, the outbreak lasted for just a year, but it was extremely deadly, causing high fevers and inflammation that led to sufferers drowning in their own bodily fluids. Knowing it was likely only a matter of time before humanity was struck with another devastating global pandemic, the team thought that it was important to better understand the disease and why it was so quick to kill. And while the Arctic is an ideal place for finding traces of old viruses that have gone dormant in the ice, it's also a danger zone. As permafrost and ice melt at unprecedented rates due to climate change, the chance that one of these dangerous pathogens escapes into the environment and infects a living being is ever present. Scientists are becoming increasingly fearful of this possibility, especially when it comes to diseases that have the potential to kill people en masse if given the chance, like smallpox and anthrax. Number 7. Century-old scotch. British explorer Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton led 3 expeditions to the South Pole between 1901 and 1919. During the Nimrod expedition from 1907 to 1909, the crew set up headquarters in a hut on Ross Island in the McMurdo Sound. Their journey was unsuccessful, and they ultimately abandoned the cabin, leaving behind pretty much anything they didn't need to take with them, including 3 crates of rare 19th century McKinley whiskey. In 2010, more than a century after it was left behind, the New Zealand Antarctic Heritage Trust embarked on a joint mission to find the scotch with White and Mackay, the owner of the distillery that sold the alcohol to Shackleton. A search team discovered the whiskey beneath the floorboards of the deserted base, where it had sat in freezing temperatures for over a century. But the conditions weren't cold enough for the liquor itself to freeze, and it was still in a liquid state. The Scotch company's owner flew the precious cargo to Scotland in a privately chartered jet in the hopes of replicating its long-lost recipe. In 2013, the whiskey was flown back to Antarctica and returned to its original resting place as part of a program to preserve the Antarctic exploration era's legacy. If given the chance, would you take a sip of this old scotch? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons. Number 6. Prehistoric plants. About 10 years ago, a team of Russian scientists discovered a cache of ancient plant seeds near the Kolyma River in Siberia, where a squirrel had deposited them around 32,000 years ago. They were retrieved from 124 feet below the permafrost near the bones of mammoths, bison, woolly rhinos, and other prehistoric mammals. The seeds belong to a flowering plant species known as Silene stenophila, or the narrow-leaved campion. After their first unsuccessful attempt at germinating the badly damaged seeds, the team extracted genetic material and grew 36 plants in culture dishes. They were slightly different from modern S. stenophila plants, with narrower leaves. The flowers eventually produced their own seeds. The successful experiment suggests that there's a gene pool of ancient species hidden in the permafrost waiting to be resurrected. And learning more about how S. stenophila remained viable for so long can help us preserve modern seeds for potential use far into the future. Some experts doubted the validity of the Russian team's radiocarbon dating methods and questioned whether the seeds were as old as the researchers claimed. Others found no fault with the study and were fascinated by the results, which they see as a hopeful sign about what else can be brought back to life after laying dormant for tens of thousands of years. Number 5. Lake Vostok. While flying over East Antarctica during the 1960s, a Russian pilot noticed a large, smooth patch of ice, suggesting that there was a lake underneath. American and British experts confirmed its existence in 1996 through airborne radar experiments. Known as Lake Vostok, the buried body of water is 143 miles long, 31 miles wide, and up to 2,625 feet deep. It's one of the world's largest lakes in terms of size and volume and is the biggest subglacial lake in Antarctica. Researchers discovered that Lake Vostok is actually much shallower on one end than the other while mapping it using remote sensing techniques. It consists of 2 basins separated by a ridge, which scientists believe may be a thermal vent. The lake is liquid despite its below freezing temperatures of 27 degrees Fahrenheit due to the weight of the overlying ice. Nobody knows how old Lake Vostok is, but its waters remained sealed off and undisturbed by sunlight for around 15 million years before it was accessed by a Russian drilling team in 2011. More than 3,500 species were identified in samples taken from the lake through DNA and RNA sequencing, including bacteria, fungi, and single-celled organisms called archaea. Scientists found both fresh and saltwater species, indicating that the lake may have been connected to the ocean before being supplied by glacier water. Number 4. Anthrax. In 2016, residents of Siberia's Yamal Peninsula experienced a mysterious anthrax outbreak. More than 2,000 reindeer were infected, Dozens of people were hospitalized and at least one child died from the bacteria. Officials were at a loss to explain what caused the disease to spread. Scientists suspected that climate change was the culprit. They theorized that a heat wave thawed the frozen soil, or permafrost, which contained the decades-old carcass of an infected reindeer. The animal died around 80 years ago and was buried in the permafrost until the heat wave melted a thicker layer than usual, exposing the remains and releasing the bacteria into the environment. Living reindeer caught the disease, which then spread to humans. The Yamal Peninsula sits high above the Arctic Circle, where most of the soil stays frozen year-round, exceeding depths of 1,000 feet in some places. But as climate change accelerates the melting of the permafrost, it's likely that there will be more outbreaks of anthrax and other diseases as pathogens from long-dead animals are released into the air. Number 3. Ancient forest. Around 50 years ago, tree stumps and logs began popping out of Alaska's Mendenhall Glacier. In 2013, researchers from the University of Alaska noticed that a lot more trees were appearing. Many were still upright and even still contained their root systems and traces of bark. The trees are from an ancient boreal forest that became encased in ice over 1,000 years ago. Scientists identified them as either spruce or hemlock trees. As the Mendenhall Glacier advanced on the forest long ago, it emitted streams of gravel-filled meltwater which cloaked the forest. The glacier then plowed over the trees. This process is being observed in the Taku Glacier, which is Alaska's only glacier that is currently growing. As it slowly descends downhill, the gargantuan body of ice is crushing rocks and spewing meltwater over a forest of cottonwood trees. Researchers expect the Mendenhall Glacier to continue receding, which it's been doing since 2005 at the steady rate of 170 feet per year. The 12-mile-long glacier has receded by at least 2 miles since 1958 after losing just a half-mile of ice from 1500 until then. Number 2. A buried mountain range. Over a half-century ago, Russian scientists noticed some unusual gravitational fluctuations beneath the Antarctic ice, spanning an area roughly the size of New York State. Later studies revealed the presence of a vast mountain range buried beneath 3 miles of ice. Known as the Gamburtsev Mountains, it's roughly the same size as the Alps, with the highest peak measuring around 15,000 feet. The 750-mile range is likely part of a rift formed by the separation of tectonic plates during the breakup of the supercontinent Gondwana around 250 million years ago. It sits beneath a 6 million square mile layer of ice known as the East Antarctic Ice Sheet. Scientists reported in a 2011 study that the mountains are probably very old based on their resemblance to the Alps. Yet their steep, rugged shape is more characteristic of a young mountain range. The team detected magnetic anomalies similar to those found in 1-billion-year-old rocks nearby, indicating that the mountain's origins date back to around the same time when continents and subcontinents collided. To learn more, researchers plan to drill through the ice and into the mountains to collect samples for further study. Number 1. Antarctic plant life. Scientists have found a plethora of evidence suggesting that Antarctica was covered in forests and lush greenery during periods of intense global warming. Around 90 years ago, during the age of the dinosaurs, the continent was a temperate rainforest, standing in stark contrast to the barren and frozen climate that dominates the landscape today. It significantly lacked ice coverage and had an annual mean temperature of around 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Wildlife thrived even through the 4 months of darkness that the region underwent every year. At the time, the planet was experiencing its warmest climate in the last 140 million years. But these warm periods date back even further, as one team of researchers learned in 2016 when they found fragments from trees dating back around 260 million years to the world's greatest mass extinction event. As today's world endures rapid climate change, scientists are exploring the possibility that plants and insects could once again thrive in Antarctica. Today, the continent's warmest areas are starting to merge with the coldest subarctic regions. According to Professor Ian Hayes, an expert on the Antarctic aquatic ecosystems who spoke with the New Zealand-based publication Stuff, the subantarctic is more diverse than Antarctica when it comes to mosses, lichens, and flowering plants. As global temperatures rise, these organisms have a better chance of surviving should they reach Antarctica, according to Hayes. Once primitive organisms emerged, more complex life forms would follow, eventually including rodents and other small mammals. Some fish and crabs are already migrating southward toward Antarctica, but these migrations threaten to snuff out rare and fragile creatures that are found nowhere else on Earth, including some that we haven't even discovered yet. Scientists are still exploring different habitats throughout Antarctica, and they're worried that any life forms within these environments will be wiped out by invasive species before we ever even knew about them. Thanks for watching. Have you ever made a shocking discovery in ice? Let us know in the comments down below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you next time for more amazing videos right here on American Eye.